Welcome everyone to today's program. My name is Rhonda Hoffman. I'm the genealogy specialist at the Buffalo and Erie County Public Library. I work in a place called the Grosvenor Room, which is our special collections department, where we have genealogy, local history, and maps, music scores, and rare books. We're open the same hours as the rest of the library. The only time that you have to make an appointment with us is if you want to view a rare book. That doesn't usually happen for genealogy resources, but in the case something was a rare book, if you looked it up in our catalog, it would tell you it was a rare book. Or you can always call the library and ask. So today's topic is finding passenger lists from 1620 to the 1950s. A handout will be emailed to everyone who's registered, so don't worry about writing down web addresses or any of my main points, because that will be included on the handout. And a recording will also be emailed to those who register. Usually I can get the recordings ready within a couple of days after the program, and it'll be put on the library's YouTube channel. So part one, we're going to talk about some background information, history of record keeping, and early passenger lists. Before 1820, unfortunately, there were no list requirements for the United States. However, ports, shipping companies may have kept their own lists. Most of these surviving lists have been published and transcribed in various sources. On these earlier lists, often children and wives were not usually listed for the early time frame, especially in the 1600s and 1700s. We do have many published sources of passenger lists in the Grosvenor Room, and we have a website that includes guides to our collection. And one of those guides is a guide on passenger lists. So if you go to our guides webpage and go to ethnic and immigrant genealogy and then select passenger lists, you'll see this nice guide that we put together in chronological order. So you can see the date ranges covered in the particular book on the left-hand side, and then where the item is and what it is on the right-hand side. Here's an example of what you might find in those published passenger lists. This is a very popular set. It's called Passenger and Immigration Lists Index, and it covers lists all the way back to the 1500s and some of them, into our own time frame. What these books usually do is you look names up alphabetically, and it will include the person's name, their age. So at the top, you see Anna Capsa, she's 9 years old. The place of arrival, Baltimore. The date of arrival, usually this is a year, so you can see 1881. And then there'll be a source code, so that 206.7, and then the page number in the source. And then what they'll have in the book is they'll have a list of those sources by number. So here's 206.7, and you can see it's a book by Leo Baca, Czech Immigration Passenger Lists, Volume 9. And it'll tell you about that particular book. And then you could check to see if we have that book in our collection. Some early lists, especially, if you've got some New England folks, this American Ancestors database is a good one to try. This is if you subscribe to the New England Historic Genealogical Society. If you're a member, you have access to this from home. But if you don't, you can get access to this in the Grosvenor Room. You can't use it from home through us, but you can use it in-house on the Grosvenor Room computers, or if you log into our Wi-Fi while you're in the Grosvenor Room, you can search these databases. One item of interest is this Great Migration Study Project that you have underlined here. And you can see that a number of individuals are listed, and then it tells you where to find a listing for that person within this reference set, and you can see it tells what ships that they came over on. Here's the entry for John Barcroft. I clicked on the top one, and it says John and Jane Barcroft are on a list of passengers from London on 12th of April, 1632, and the ship was the James. And then down at the bottom, it says the ship on which the Barcroft sails was the James, which arrived at Boston on 12th of June. So that's the kind of information you might find. Some of this early information may not be traditional passenger lists. For example, what I just showed you, the Barcroft, it was something from a list of licenses to go beyond the seas in England for certain dates in the 1600s. So they would have to apply to go onto the seas. And usually it will list the ship name and the general location to where the person was going. And the date is the date of oath, the date of the oath that they needed to take to get a license, or the date of the issuing of the license. You'll also see many lists of convicts or indentured servants bound to America for this early time frame, the 1600s and 1700s. There is something that we have in the Grosvenor Room. There were some alien registrations for the War of 1812. It's called British Aliens in the United States during the War of 1812 by Kenneth Scott. And it might include the person's name, age, years in the US, a physical description. It might mention the person's wife and the number of children, their occupation, town of residence, if they were in the military, and if they submitted a declaration of intent to become a US citizen. You might also find the date of immigration, the country of birth, criminal activities, and the names and ages of family members. So that's a book that we have in the Grosvenor Room. And to find some of those early lists that might have been kept by ports or the shipping companies, you want to check the collections of libraries, archives, museums, and historical societies. A lot of you have probably heard of the website WorldCat, which is a free website. It's a catalog of all different libraries across the world. Not every library is in there, but many are. So you can see what other locations have. And there's also a website that you may not have heard of called Archive Grid. It's very similar to WorldCat in that it lists the holdings of libraries and archives all over, especially in the United States, but other locations as well. But the Archive Grid focuses more on archival sources versus just general books. When you're searching those sites, good search terms to search for are passenger lists, manifests, customs house, logbook, names of shipping lines, and travelers' diaries. So this is a sample search in Archive Grid. I searched for logbook, which you can see up towards the top right. And you can see I got a number of logbooks for different ships, different time frames. A logbook will tell some of the major happenings on a ship. It's probably not going to have a list of all of the passengers, but especially in the case that if like a child was born or someone passed away while on the trip, those kinds of things might be noted, or if some other important event happened associated with a particular passenger, they may be named. The US began requiring passenger lists in 1820, although full compliance did not occur until 1905, so certain ports might not be available until that time frame. I just wanted to show you the general look of a passenger list. This one is from 1910. And you can see it's kind of like a census record. You've got at the top things like what ship it was, the Baltic, it's sailing from Liverpool, and the date it's sailing. And then you've got this schedule, kind of like a census schedule, where you've got everyone's name and other information about the passengers. And I'll show you this in more detail in a minute. So that was a more recent one. That was in the 1900s. Ones from 1820 to 1892 are not quite as detailed. They still have this general look of what I showed you. So this one is, top one is from 1846. You've got the name of the ship and where they were traveling from and where they're going to. And you've got people's names, their ages, their gender, their occupation, their citizenship, and where they're going to. And over in the far column is a remarks column where you might see, like if someone passed away, you might see a notation to that. And down at the bottom, this is one from 1890, which includes a little bit more detail. This one also includes the number of pieces of luggage that they traveled with, and it tells the location where this person traveled on the boat. So these two people traveled in a cabin versus in the steerage. So I just mentioned steerage. Most of our ancestors would have traveled this way. Steerage is a space where a lot of people are put together instead of separate cabins. So here you can see where these are some beds that people would be sleeping on. And you've got your just general common area where people are socializing. Over to the right, here's a big table where people would have their meals. From 1893 forward, you find much more detail on passenger lists. This is where you get the really good information. For example, their last legal residence. So you will see a specific town in a foreign country where the person lived. You'll see where they started their journey, their final destination, if they were ever in the US before, where and when. If they were joining a relative in the US, the name and address and relationship to that relative will be listed. And in 1906, they began recording where the person was born, and you'll get a specific town in the foreign country where the person was born. And in 1907, they started listing the name and address of the nearest relative in their home country. And you'll see a specific town where that person lives and the relationship to the person who's traveling. So here's an example of a more detailed list. Here we see a Sigrid Alto, and it tells her age, 22 years. It says she's female, she's single. Her occupation is servant. She can read and write. She's Finnish. Down at the bottom here, this would continue over the right-hand side of the page, but I cut it in half to make it bigger. So here we have last permanent residence. So she lived in a place called Saisma in Finland. The name and complete address of the nearest relative or friend in the country where that person came. So her mother, Maria, and then it lists a surname, and then it lists also of Saisma. And then we've got the final destination, New York, New York. Whenever you're looking through passenger lists, make sure that you turn the page forwards and backwards, because there are generally 2 pages of information. So I turned the page and there's more information. Her passage was paid by her sister. She has, I think that's $25 or $28. That's how much money she had with her when she's traveling. Has she ever been in the US before? No. And then it says the relative she's going to live with is her sister, Alma, Alto, and it gives her sister's specific address in New York City. And there's lots of different questions, whether she was a polygamist, whether she's an anarchist, her health. It says that she has good health. And then down at the bottom, it gives a physical description. So she was 5'2", had light blonde hair, blue eyes. She doesn't have any specific marks of identification, things like a scar or a birthmark. And her place of birth was Saisma in Finland. In terms of record survival, unfortunately, some passenger lists didn't survive. But from 1820 through 1874, there were quarterly reports, including copies of passenger lists made for the Secretary of State by the Collector of Customs at each location. Sometimes these are the only things that survived. So if you see a list and you think it just looks like it includes very little information, oftentimes it's one of these lists. So you may only get partial data, but at least it's something. If you're curious about what ports your ancestor might have went to or what records out there exist, the National Archives website has a list of over 300 locations where your ancestor could have come to the US. And it tells what passenger lists are available for those particular ports. This link is on your handout, so don't worry about writing that long link down. There were many immigration laws, and those changed over the years. The first restrictions began in 1882, so before that time frame, there weren't these different restrictions. People could just come into the country. Here's an example of some things you might see in these laws. This is from March of 1891, and it lists classes of persons denied the right to immigrate to the US. Insane, paupers, persons with contagious diseases, persons convicted of felonies or misdemeanors of moral turpitude, and polygamists. And so you can see here, this picture is they're going through a health screening to see if they should be allowed in the US. You can see over to the right, there's a gentleman looking at this lady's eyes, and there was a particular eye disease that was very contagious. That's one of the things that they would look for. It wasn't until 1921 that the first immigrant quota restrictions occurred. So quotas would allow a certain number of people in from various locations, and those amounts would be different for the different locations. Sometimes upon initial inspection, people might have been held aside for special inquiry, and you might see on their list where it says SI by their name. Those held back, it was very subjective. For example, they could have been held back for poor physique or moral turpitude. So for example, maybe someone was held aside, like if a woman was pregnant and she was traveling alone, she could have been denied entry if they thought the child was out of wedlock, something like that. If they were held back, then they faced a special inquiry trial. Investigations may have been done on the immigrant while they were held in Ellis Island custody. So here's an example. You can see there's a number of SIs by this family of people here. And you can see that then it's stamped admitted. So they were held aside for special inquiry, and then they were admitted. If your ancestor was held back specifically at New York City, I've seen a lot of these lists of detained aliens beginning in 1903 for New York City. And a lot of these, may not be available for other ports. I believe there are some for Philadelphia as well, but I don't know if they're on Ancestry or not. So here's the list of detained aliens. Let me just zoom in a little bit. So it'll tell why they were detained. And most of the time I've found on these lists, it's women traveling alone. They were trying to protect women. And so they would hold them until a family member would come up and pick them up. So you can see like two uncle, two brother, two uncle. You can see all these two sister. And then it might list those particular family members' names and perhaps their addresses. And it'll list the inspector's name. And you can tell by the meals how long they stayed there. So how many breakfasts and dinners and suppers that they had. So if you see lots of days here, then something might have been going on. Rejected immigrants would be sent back at the cost of the shipping company. So it was important to shipping companies that people had all their right documentation and that they looked healthy when they boarded, because they didn't want to have to pay the costs associated with shipping the people back. But then also for certain timeframes, the company may have also had to pay a fine. And I looked up one of the fines and it was like $2,700 in modern day. So it was quite a bit of money that they might have to pay. Part 2. So now we're going to talk about preparing for your passenger list search and records that provide passenger list data. So pick your ancestor who you want to find their passenger list, and you want to summarize your research about that person. Think about their birth date and place. We don't need a specific town, but just, what country did they come from? Who might they have traveled with? So family member names and their dates of births. So especially think of parents, siblings, spouses, children, neighbors, or friends. Then you want to try to narrow down the immigration and naturalization dates if they naturalized. Naturalization is when the process of becoming a citizen. So look over your completed research. What's the date of the first piece of evidence of your person being in the United States? Whether it's something like a baptismal record of a child that was born here, or maybe it's their first listing in the city directory, or their first listing in a census records. You want to leave no leaf unturned. You want to look through everything that you have on your person to properly identify them. You want to find all of the census records that may indicate details about immigration. Those census records, particularly from 1900 to 1930, are very great in listing details about immigration. So you want to find all of those census records for the person you're searching for and who you think they may have traveled with. For example, from 1900 to 1930, the US federal census asks the year of immigration to the US or the number of years in the US. The New York State censuses of 1905, 15, and 25 also list that information. The 1920 census asks the year of naturalization, which means the year they became a US citizen. The New York State 1925 census asks if naturalized, when and where. And then the 1855 New York State Census asks, how many years of a resident were you in this town? And of course, that could mean they might have lived in another town before then. But if that person is an immigrant ancestor, maybe that would indicate the year that they came to the United States. Here's an example from the 1920 census. So if we look at Salvatore Lanza, over here, the year that he came to the US was 1906, and he is still an alien, so he hasn't naturalized by 1920. There's a couple of other people living with him, so his wife and son, they came over a little later. So it is often that a head of household would come over first and then settle, and then the rest of the family would come over later. And if we look up to the people above this family, we see a Joseph Spino. He came in 1908, and this PA means he's taken out his first papers, which means he's filed a declaration of intent to become a US citizen, but he's not fully naturalized yet. And then below him, there's Vincent Lauza, who came in 1909, and he's naturalized, and he naturalized in the year 1918. So now you want to think about finding documents that provide passenger list data. What you need might be easily accessible. So if your ancestor arrived in the US after 1906 and was naturalized, something called the Certificate of Arrival would have been created as part of the naturalization process. That certificate provides the immigrant's date, port, and ship of arrival. Generally, you would obtain naturalization records from a county clerk's office, so like Erie County Hall if you're from Erie County, or the National Archives. This is an example certificate of arrival. A gentleman named William Henley came to the US November 1st, 1923, aboard the SS President Polk, that's the ship name, and he came to Portland, Maine. Beginning June 30th, 1906, at naturalization, an immigrant's name on naturalization papers had to match the passenger lists. So if the immigration name was wrong or had been legally changed after the person came to the US, an immigrant could show proof and pay a fee, and the name would be crossed off on the passenger list and changed on the immigration record, so the passenger list. Sometimes immigrants just naturalized under the name that was on the passenger list. So here's what might be an example of one of those. So we see someone with the last name Rosenthal. The Rosenthal is crossed out and it's changed to Carmel. And there's somebody's initials that made that change there. So it could be that someone changed their name later on. And then when they went to naturalize, they paid that fee and changed their name to Carmel. Or this could be if an error was made on the passenger list. Someone wrote their name down wrong, then an immigration official may have crossed out the name and corrected it. There are a lot of rumors, fallacies out there about name changes that happened at Ellis Island. Name changes did not happen at Ellis Island. What would happen is wherever they started their journey, a passenger list was made out by that shipping company. And then when they got to Ellis Island, they would be lined up. You can see it kind of looks like an amusement park. See how there's all these rows over here to the right? These are people waiting to be sort of checked in. And then they would go up to these folks here. This back row are immigration officials at Ellis Island. And you can see these big sheets of paper. These are the passenger lists. So what they would do is they would then question each person. And usually they would be lined up in order. You can see there's like a little thing on his jacket. Usually they would be lined up in order of how they appear on the passenger list. Then they would go talk to the official. And if they did not speak English, There were many translators for all different languages there. So see how this guy right here, he's probably a translator working with this gentleman and the immigration official. And they would simply then ask this person who arrived questions about themselves to make sure that they were the person who was on the list. And that's all they did. They didn't change any names or anything. There could have been an error on the original passenger list in terms of names or in terms of spellings of names, and that's where errors occur. So when someone wants to become a US citizen, first you would file a declaration of intent. And on those declaration of intents, particularly from late 1906 forward, you're going to see where the person came from. This person is Queenstown, Ireland. He came on the President Polk. And if we zoom in here, it says that he arrived at the Port of New York about the 3rd day of November in 1923. So you could obtain that and find out the passenger list that way. That same type of information was on the petition for citizenship. So after someone filed the petition, declaration of intent, then they would wait a few years and then they would complete the citizenship process. So this is the second form. It includes much of the same information as a declaration of intent. And you can see it's got that same time frame when he arrived and the port he arrived to and the ship that he arrived on. The dates are off by 2 different days, so that is a slight difference. And again, you're going to see this detailed information from late 1906 forward. Sometimes I see this kind of information in the early 1900s or maybe late 1890s, but a lot of times citizenship papers weren't that detailed in like the 1800s, but it just depends on the particular location as to how detailed they are. You would get naturalization papers, usually from county clerk's offices where the person resided when they were naturalized, or from late 1906 forward, also the National Archives. There are many naturalization records on Family Search for counties, for the counties of Western New York in particular, but other areas all across the country too. There are some in Ancestry Library Edition, especially for large cities like New York City. Other documents, which may include passenger list information, passports, visas, alien registration forms, and there's more details about these documents on your handout. This isn't really a class on these particular documents, but I wanted to give you some leads if you have problems searching in passenger lists, which I'm going to show you in a little bit. So first, next in our part 3, we're going to talk about how to find US passenger lists. And we're first going to talk about if you do know that information in advance, say you have your ancestors' naturalization records, and then you want to go find them in passenger lists. Then we're going to talk about New York City and immigration. We're going to talk about using passenger list websites and finding passenger lists with Ancestry Library Edition. So we're going to first find a list with known information using Ancestry Library Edition. And Ancestry Library Edition is almost the same thing as Ancestry.com, which you may subscribe to at home. It's available at every Buffalo and Erie County Public Library location. You do have to visit in person. The company does not allow us to let there be at-home access. So you can go to any one of our locations across Erie County. If you don't live in Erie County, you can check with your local library to see if they subscribe to Ancestry Library Edition, or you could subscribe to Ancestry.com for a fee yourself at home. So this is who we saw earlier, William Henley, and it's got all his details about when he traveled. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen and then I'm going to restart. I'm going to share the internet with you. So here we are on the library's homepage, which is buffalolib.org. That'll be on your handout. And you go to Research and Resources. And then you go to Databases. Then you go to Genealogy. And then Ancestry Library. And again, this is only available in library. So what you want to do next is go to the search menu, go to Immigration and Travel, go to Passenger Lists off to the right here. And with our known information, we're going to type in his name, and the person we were searching for is William Henley. And we know his time of arrival. So I'm just going to put November 1923. And I'm going to make that exact to that year, 1923, since we know that was when he was supposed to arrive. And he supposedly arrived at Portland, Maine. So I'm going to input that. And if you want, you could just search with this information, but we know that he was on the President Polk. I'm just going to put in a keyword Polk there. And you could fill in more information if you wanted to. You could put in the year of birth. You could put in the gender, but I'm just going to go ahead and search like this. And you just click search. And we've got 3 different hits here. I'm going to click on the first one. You can see it gives you a little bit of information to see if that could be your person. You can hover over the link and see a little more information. If you want to go directly to the passenger list, you can click View, and it will open up. And here he is, William Henley. And here we can see all that type of information that I showed you earlier with Sigrid Alto, his age. He's a general laborer, he's English. He's from Castlebar, Ireland. His father's name and where he lives in the foreign country. And he's going to New York City eventually. And then you can turn the page and find his line number again. So he was line number 20. So here he is. He paid for his own ticket. He's got, I think that's $25 with him. He's going to go live with his uncle, Mr. John Mullahy. And some other details about him here. So that's a way to search if you know the information already. But of course, you may not know the information. Just going to go back to my presentation, my slides for a minute. So if you don't know when your ancestor came, then usually what you're going to do is you're going to use the information that is the easiest available to you. And usually that's online resources. Want to give you a little bit of background because though everyone didn't come through New York City from 1820 to 1900, about 70% of immigrants came through New York City. And a lot of people think, if they came into New York, they definitely came in through Ellis Island, but Ellis Island wasn't always there. So before August 1st, 1855, your ancestor would have come into New York Harbor. There was no assistance to immigrants. There was no processing of immigrants. You would just, come into the US. Unfortunately, there were a lot of problems. A lot of immigrants were taken advantage of. There were these people called immigrant runners, and they would try to do things to trick immigrants sometimes, or sometimes they might have been hired by particular hotels or like railroad lines to try to get them to use to stay at their hotel or their railroad. But like I said, sometimes they would take advantage of immigrants. So like this guy might be selling him a false ticket or a ticket that's much more expensive than other places. Over here, there might be somebody someone might be diverting an immigrant while someone else is stealing from them. Sometimes immigrant runners would sort of hijack people's bags and force them to stay at a particular hotel or go to a specific shipping line. So they saw all these things happening. Different government officials saw these happening. And in the New York City area, they decided we need to make a safer place for immigrants. So they opened what was called Castle Garden. This was from August 1st, 1855 to April 18th, 1890. So if your ancestor came into New York during this time frame, this is where your ancestor would have come through, Castle Garden. Then, so when they went through Castle Garden, they helped aid immigrants like with things like a labor exchange or currency exchange. They helped them arrange for transportation to wherever it is that they were going. This was funded by a head tax. They did have guards there. That doesn't mean that certain people might not have been corrupt. Those things still might have happened. There used to be a Castle Garden website, but it went defunct. New York City, if you arrived from 1890 into 1891, it was around this time frame when then the federal government decided to take control of passengers coming into the US. And the federal government wanted to take over Castle Garden, and then they would get the head tax for that. But New York City was like, no, if we're not going to get the head tax, then you can't use Castle Garden. So for this time frame here, your ancestor would have come in through the New York City barge office at New York Harbor. And at that time, they were building Ellis Island. So from January 1st, 1892 through June 13th, 1897, your ancestor would have come into Ellis Island. And then there was a fire. So from June of 1897 into December 1900, again, they went through the New York City barge office while they were rebuilding Ellis Island. And then they got a better building for Ellis Island. So until 1924, then your ancestor would have gone through Ellis Island. After World War I, the US began to emerge as a potential world power. So US embassies were established in countries all over the world, and then immigrants were applying for visas to get into the US. And they would do that at American consulates in their country of origin. And the necessary paperwork was completed at the consulate, as well as the medical inspection was also conducted there. After 1924, the only people who were detained at Ellis Island were those who had problems with their paperwork, as well as war refugees and displaced persons. And then November 1954, Ellis Island officially closed. There is an Ellis Island website where it's a free website. You can search New York City lists from 1820 to 1957 on this website, and you can see the lists. This is the site. It's on your handout. One site that I like to use instead of the Ellis Island site is stevemorse.org. So this is someone, it's just an individual who makes helpful tools for people to use when they're doing genealogy research. And one of the tools he has, excuse me, I'm sorry, that's not the right Steve Morse. One-Step Pages by Stephen P. Morse. And one of them is for Ellis Island and Castle Garden searching. So you can do Ellis Island gold form. And I kind of like to use this one. It allows for different search options than the Ellis Island website. The Ellis Island website certainly is a good thing to use, but I kind of like this one because it's just a more streamlined, straightforward way to search. So what you can do is you can search for the person's name, and you could do starts with or sounds like or contains. So if you have a name like Anthony, you could put ANT, and then this will have any name that with any ending that starts with ANT. Or maybe you have a harder name to pronounce or spell. Maybe you know, people just spell it all different ways. So you can do a sounds like. And then you can put a year or range of arrival. So if you know, oh, they came between 1892 and 1900, you can do that. You can put how old they would have been at their time of arrival. So I'm putting from 20 to 40. And then you can even, if we go down here, you can see, you can customize your results. What do you want shown after the searches? The name, the town that they came from, their year of arrival, their year of birth, age. You've got all these different choices. And then you can pick how the results are sorted. Do you want it sorted by the people's names or their date of arrival? And you can click search. And you can see it is pretty broad. We put in the last name Polson. So it is pretty broad as terms of what sounds like is, but you can see we've got all those ANT names, first names. And once we get down to the P's, you can see names that are similar, really similar to Polson. Paulsano, Paulson, Paulsen. And then there's more entries on another page. You've got those Paulsons and Polsini and Polsons with P-O-U-L. And if you wanted to view the passenger record, you could click one and it'll take you to the Ellis Island website. You have to have an account to log in. So you could then log in. And then you'll get that information. They will, Ellis Island will offer you things that you could purchase, like you could have this certificate made for your ancestor, but you don't have to do that. You can click on the other tabs. They'll sell you a printout of a passenger list, or you can just view it. If you scroll down, you can view the list. When you hover over it, it'll zoom in usually. You can see how it zooms in. So next, I'm going to go back to Ancestry. So let's say we want to search. This is probably what I would do first, is I usually go to Ancestry. You want to go to search menu in Immigration and Travel. And choose passenger lists. So this is when we don't know when, exactly when our ancestor came over, or the ship they came over on, or port they came in. I would just search Ancestry. And I usually put in a person's first name and last name. And I'll usually put in their approximate year of birth. So I'll put in, say, I think she was born in 1842. I'll give it a couple of years buffer. So plus or minus 2 years. And arrival, 1882, is when I've narrowed down by looking at the documents I've found on the family. See, I think they might have arrived around 1882, and I give it a little buffer of plus or minus 2 years. And I'm going to go ahead and click search. So you can see I don't get any results, and I knew that was going to happen. Sometimes you do have to play with different search methods when looking at these passenger lists. Just like we all use census records, and there's difficulties in name spellings and people hearing things wrong or just spelling them like they sound. So one thing you can do is called truncation. So let's say her name on the passenger list wasn't Julia, maybe it was Juliana. I'll put JUL asterisk, and that'll bring up any names that start with JUL, and say the last name is different. Like women were usually, for Polish women, they were usually SKA instead of SKI. I'm going to put just the first part of the name and then an asterisk so it can have any ending. Then you just click search. And I still don't get any hits. So you just want to keep trying. Don't get frustrated. Just think of different ways to search. You can put an asterisk at the beginning of the name too, not just the ending. You can put it even in the middle of a name if you want to. So I'm putting, say, the first name was spelled differently or something. I'm putting the ending there, and the beginning can be anything. So if I search that, I don't have anything there. Now see, that worked yesterday and it's not working today. I just want to try that search one more time. Okay, I don't know why it didn't show up the first time, but so now I find someone, Juliana Yolabsky, and it kind of looks like the right birth time frame, the right arrival time frame. So at this point, you want to look at the list itself. And I'm going to click view to see the list. I want to see who else she's traveling with. Does it look like family members that I know of hers? And if I scroll down the list, this is her. And it's an open G. So someone indexed this with a Y, Yolabsky, instead of a G, Golubsky, because these are her children's name, Theodosia, Constance, Valerie, Johann. They've all got the right ages. So I do believe this is the correct family. There are some other things that you could, other ways that you could try to search. So let's say I just want to show you other things that I found that works. You can use a question mark in place of one letter. So this is something that also worked for me. Putting question marks in the place of a couple of letters. And there I have her again. And something I'll try, if there is a family member that you think traveled with the person you're searching for, and they have a little bit of a less common name, you can try searching by first name. And I thought for this time frame, 1880s, Valerie probably wasn't that common. So I put in Valerie exact. You want to make sure you update the birth information to the person you're changing your search to. So she was born about 1880. So I'm putting plus or minus 2 years for 1880, leaving the arrival year, and then clicking search. And if I look through the list, there's Valerie Yolabsky, and that's that same list that I found with Julia. So that's how you can search ancestry if you don't know when your ancestor came. Another thing that I will try is family search. And one thing that you can do is you can go to the search menu, search records. And you can input your person's name. So I wanted to see what would happen if I tried Julia Golubsky. Here, you can show more options. If you wanted to. And what you want to do is go to type and choose immigration and naturalization. And then you can search. This one, you have to have a free account by Family Search. And you can look through your hits. You can also, if you get too many hits, you can put in a year range. So say I want to do 1880 through 1884. I'll do 1885. You could search. And there it narrowed things down, and it brought Julianne Golubsky right to the top. And if we looked at this list, it is the same list. I'm going to click on the camera and it'll bring up the list. What I wanted to show you too is sometimes different databases have different image quality. Now, I don't know if you noticed, but on the ancestry list, things were kind of fuzzy. And if you look at this list, it's quite clear. So sometimes a different database might have a clearer image. Something else that you can do is if you go to search and catalog, let's say you want to try to find passenger lists from other countries. Some other countries might have things like passenger lists or passports. Maybe you want to see if you can find them that way. Try doing a catalog search and do a keyword search. And put in the country that you're interested in. Say I've got somebody from Finland. And then you can try different search terms. One I recommend trying is immigration. You could also put in the word passenger and put online, so you only get online records, and click search. And then you'll get a bunch of different hits. You can see this one looks like, you've got immigrant in the name of the record, even though this is in Finnish, you can kind of see that. And keep looking through the list. And you can pick, choose to pick one of them. So if I clicked on that one that looks like immigrant lists, you'll see information in the foreign language, but then there'll be an explanation in English. So this is specifically from a port called Malmo. And then you could view these records. You can see the different time frames. And if you clicked on the camera, you could view these records if you wanted to. So that's just another thing that you can do. There are some foreign passenger lists in Ancestry. So I had a hard time looking for my family in Ancestry, my Polish families. So sometimes if you can't find them in the incoming US passenger lists, which I showed you a minute ago, you can try to look for outgoing passenger lists. So I'm going to choose the search menu in Ancestry and click all categories. And then I'm going to see what's available for different countries. So for Poland, I had a really good luck looking in European passenger lists, specifically German lists. So a lot of people from Poland went through Germany. They could have gone other places as well. And I'm going to click View All German Records. And they break down the records into different categories. You can see military, here's the immigration and emigration records. You can see there's 15 different record sets here. I'm going to click on that. And I'm going to look at these lists. And sometimes this unique to Germany category doesn't show everything. You want to click on switch to all collections that are related to Germany. Or whatever country you chose. And with that, I've got 45 different hits. And one thing that pops up are the Hamburg, Germany passenger lists from 1850 to 1934. So I'm going to select that. You can see it's a really big data set. Almost 6 million names are in here. And I'm going to search. I have a family Miga. The gentleman's name is Lawrence. And he was born about 1850. I'm going to put plus or minus 2 years. They departed, they probably traveled about 1882. And I'm going to search. I don't get anything. I'm going to edit my search and I'm going to take out that first name and try just putting in the last name. And the first couple that come up, it's got the spelling that my family spelled their names. And I know that his wife's name was Julia. And then we see this name Warvin. And this is this is like a Polish version of Lawrence. So I think this is them. So I'm going to click on that, the Julia, and it's got Warvin, Julia, and then a child named Tekla, and I know that was one of their children's names. I'm going to click on the list. There they are, Warvin, Julie, and Tekla. And what's great about some of these lists, this is a specific town that they're from. I'm probably going to pronounce this wrong, but Radomysl. And US incoming lists for this time frame wouldn't list this detail. So even if you find their US passenger list, see if there might be foreign outgoing lists from where your people came from, because they might include more detail than what the incoming US passenger list might have on them. There are, passenger lists from other countries in Ancestry. One that a lot of people will be interested in from this area are Canadian passenger lists. There are Canadian passenger lists in here. And I'm just going into Ancestry's card catalog. This is another way to find passenger lists. So you can see Canada incoming lists. So there might be some lists here, 1865 timeframe. So just wanted to show you that, but I know there are some British outgoing lists as well. So check your country, check the search all categories, choose your country and see what else might be there. Going back to the card catalog, something that a lot of people from this area are going to be interested in are border crossing records. People were not tracked coming from Canada or from Mexico coming into the US until the late, mid 1890s or more recently into the early 1900s. So to find the border crossing records, I usually go into Ancestry's card catalog and then put border in the title. And then you'll see the different records. So here you can see crossings from Mexico to the US beginning in 1895. And then there's border crossings from Canada to US, again, starting in 1895. You can see they go into the 1960s. There's something else listed here, which is border crossings from US to Canada, but we want coming into the US. So I'm going to go ahead and click that one. And I'm going to search for somebody's name. just like we did before, put in a first name, put in a last name. Put in an approximate year of birth. I know she might have come around 1921. Port of Buffalo. And then I click search. You don't have to put the port that you think they came into. You can leave that blank. And I find a few different listings. There's this first one looks interesting. Gertrude Meehan, alias and Nino. It's got the right time frame coming into Buffalo. These might look like just like passenger lists. So this is one that looks just like a passenger list. It's got the same questions that you saw on the earlier list from like the 1890s forward for US passenger lists. So here's Gertrude Meehan, alias and Nino. So you do sometimes, if people went by different names, see an alias name. These are some of her children, ranging from 2 years to 13 years old. And it says that they were debarred, which means they were not allowed in. And like the passenger lists, so she was living in Toronto, was her last permanent residence, and she's headed to New York City. You always want to turn the page. And it says she was not allowed in due to immoral purposes. And her children are rejected. It says LPC, you'll see this a lot. It means likely public charge. So it means that it's thought by immigration officials that these people are not going to be able to support themselves and the government will end up paying for them. You can see someone up a little higher, they were not allowed in. It says it's physically defective. So they must have had some sort of health or injury, something like that going on with them. So I was curious regarding immoral purposes. And one thing I thought of is a few of the children were like 10, 12, 10, 13 years old. And then there was a 2-year-old. And I wondered if, I don't know, they thought maybe that child was out of wedlock or something like that. That could have happened. I'm going to go back to our results list because we had more than one result. And you can see there's multiple hits here, but I'm going to look at this bottom one. This one, so she tried to come back in later in 1922 through Niagara Falls. And this is the other format you might see these border crossing records in, are these card files. And you can see she was rejected for immoral purposes, and it says adultery. So I'm wondering if one of those children were illegitimate, or could she have been pregnant when she was coming in and she's not with a husband? They may not have allowed her in for that reason. But you see the same type of information that's on the passenger list. It's just put in card format. So where she was born, where she's going to, who she's going to go live with, her last foreign residence. And it's got, this gives a physical description down at the bottom. Sometimes you have to turn the page and you might see more details, or it could be on the opposite page. And this is where you might see why someone was rejected too. Like you can see a likely public charge here for children, likely public charge. So that's where you might see that information too. I have one last thing I wanted to show you. So this is one of those books I told you about early in the class, the books that might index passenger lists. This is a set for Irish famine immigrants that came over like late 1840s, early 1850s. And I just became curious. I looked at this list and I found a couple of children that it says born at sea, but I decided to focus on this U Bootby. It says born at sea, infant, September 15th is the date. And, I wonder, why are they down there why is it down there all by itself, that baby? And I wanted to see if I could find the family that it belonged with. And I looked all through the list, and the closest thing I found is I found a John Boothby, Boothby. He's in his 30s. He's got, a wife, and he's got these other kids. I think that's 14, 7, 4, 2 years old. So certainly they could have had a baby while traveling on board the ship. And I'm like, well, where did that information come from that they transcribed? Because I don't see that baby listed here. And I looked and I thought, well, it could be, sometimes these databases, they optimize images and there might be some white space that ends up on the record. You can see how pretty blank this looks here or here or here. And maybe that baby was written in the remarks column and it got faded out somehow in the digitization process. And I looked, at the end, I thought, oh, well, maybe they're at the end of this list, but they weren't. I did see these couple folks that were squeezed in way at the bottom. These two people were stowaways. And I thought, oh, well, maybe the babies were on the last page. Maybe you turn the page. And I turned the page and there was no other page on Ancestry for this list. Didn't see the babies anywhere on this list. So when you're looking through those books that I told you about, you want to read the book's introduction because it'll tell you the original source of their information. It'll tell you the scope of their search, tips on the research subject. So on like Irish coming to the US during that famine timeframe, their indexing process, the arrangement of the books, any abbreviations, symbols, guides to codes used in the index, maps. There might be maps in there. And what I found in that introduction was that the lists used in the transcriptions were the original paper passenger lists, which were located at Temple University in Philadelphia. So I wondered, is it possible that there was another page that was not filmed? Like maybe those babies were squeezed in at the bottom and somehow that last page didn't get microfilmed. It's the microfilm that these databases use to digitize and put the records online. Or maybe in the digitization process, somehow that last image was missed. So I contacted the National Archives and I asked if they could either, if they had the paper forms anymore, or if they could look on the microfilm for me to see if that baby is listed on that sheet. And I contacted Temple University and they didn't have the original passenger lists anymore. And they gave them to some other archive. And that other archive told me they didn't have the lists anymore. And the National Archives were very kind and they started doing some research for me. And they came up with this gentleman named Arthur Boothby. This was an alumni directory for him, I believe. And it says he got a BS. He's a chief draftsman. And look, it says born September 22nd, 1850 at sea. The son of John, born 1816, and Eliza Boothby. And those were the names of that couple that had the children on the list. And this is the time frame that they came to the United States. So this is just a little lesson to show you that even if you think you've located the passenger list, some of those published works could have value. So if you're missing somebody, maybe those books that transcribed from original passenger lists might have some data in them that the online resources don't have. So that is my presentation for you today. I'm going to, if you have any questions, you can unmute yourself or you can type something in the question box and I'll see what's in the chat. I see a question here. Has Stephen Morse taken over for the records from Castle Garden? For many early immigrants, this was our only source for ship names and passenger lists. Is he the only source? The Castle Garden records are in Ancestry, so you can find them in Ancestry, and Family Search has them as well. And they're just called New York City lists. It doesn't matter what port that the person came in under. And after the class, remember that I will email you the handout and I will email you a recording of this class. Anyone else have questions? So as always, as you digest all of that information that I just gave you, if you have any questions, you can email me. When I email you, I'll email you the handout and the recording. So you can respond to my email and I'll be happy to answer any questions that you might have, or you could call the library and ask for the Grosvenor room and ask questions if you prefer to do things that way as well. So I hope you all get to searching for your ancestors, and I'll see you next time. Have a great day. Bye. Thank you, everyone.